Well, good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Eric Patterson. I serve as a research fellow here at the Berkley Center. It's my old academic home. I was here full-time for 4 years previously, and I have an affiliation with Regent University and with the Religious Freedom Institute right here in Washington, D.C. And we're delighted that you could join us for this discussion of House Resolution 1009, sponsored by Congressman Jerry McNerney. In a few moments, I'll introduce to you our distinguished panel and turn it over to the Congressman to make a few remarks. But let me first say that this issue of thinking about just war language and national policy is near and dear to our hearts right here at the Berkley Center and at Georgetown University. The mission of the Berkley Center is to promote peace and justice worldwide with a focus on doing that through academic knowledge, training, and educational resources. Here at Georgetown, we've been discussing just war thinking for many, many years. The namesake of the Walsh School, Father Walsh, advised on these principles in the middle of the 20th century. William V. O'Brien wrote a famous book on just war thinking. Father Langen wrote on this. The recently departed Drew Christensen, Father Drew, wrote extensively on this. The Berkley Center has been at the center of these efforts for more than a decade, including a major academic conference featuring one of our own faculty, the Levy Chair, the late Jean Bethke Elshtain, on how to apply just war thinking to late and to post-conflict. Classic just war thinking asks two questions. When is it just to employ force? And when that decision is made by legitimate political authorities acting on just cause with the right intention and some secondary prudential criteria, then on the battlefield, how can force be employed in ways that is restrained and moral? Over time, a third set of questions around late and post-conflict justice have arisen as well. Well, today we're going to look at a very specific case, and that is how the U.S. Congress should consider this language, this thinking, when it considers authorizing military force. We have a distinguished panel here. We're reprising a panel that we did at the Catholic University of America a month ago, and we're here bringing it to the Georgetown community. I'll introduce those speakers as they come forward, but for now, let me turn it over to a distinguished American public servant, the sponsor of House Resolution 1009 from the 9th District of California. Would you please help me in welcoming Congressman Jerry McNerney?
Well, good noon to everyone, and I want to thank Eric and Joe and the panel for participating this morning or this noon, and it's a follow-up from an event that we had about a month ago. Basically, we want to talk about whether HRES, House Resolution 1009, would be beneficial if it was adopted or passed. And we're following up with the discussion we had, I think it was in September 13th, at the Catholic University. It was very well, a very open discussion. I think it was very beneficial. And I hear from one of our panelists, Dr. Love here, that some of our students got excited about. So that's kind of what we're trying to accomplish here. I did introduce this bill, House Resolution 1009, in March 29th of this year. Now I want to talk a little bit about what a House Resolution is. A House Resolution is something that's passed solely by the House of Representatives. It's not discussed or passed by the Senate. It doesn't need presidential signature, but it doesn't have the effect of law. Basically, what House resolutions do is bind the House to certain kinds of activities. House resolutions, for example, are rules that regulate the debate of a bill in the House, and they have other purposes, but they only regulate activities in the House of Representatives itself. So this House resolution would not have the effect of law, but it would regulate how the debate on just war, on authorizing military force or declaring a war would take place within the House of Representatives. And the way the resolution is written is a sense of Congress that we debate the just war principles before declaring war or authorizing the use of military force. So it's really a suggestion. And even though it's a fairly mild approach to this subject, I think it's an important first step. As far as I know, in recent history, no nation has incorporated just war thinking at that level of government and that sort of thinking about how to decide whether we're going declare war or authorize military force. So I want to make some points. I've got a really good speech here, but I'm going to just try and wing it a little bit with some talking points instead of trying to read it. Basically, the House of Representatives shares the constitutional responsibility with the United States Senate on declaring war or authorizing the use of military force. But the House of Representatives is the body that traditionally originates that sort of a measure, that sort of a law. You can call authorization AUMFs or declarations of war. Those are laws. So those laws are, those bills are originated traditionally in the House of Representatives, not in the Senate. So it is our constitutional responsibility in the House of Representatives to declare war or authorize military force. Now, as we all know, wars cause grave harm. They cause deaths, they cause people to lose property, they cause famine, and other sorts of maladies that can affect society. So it's incumbent upon us, and this is obvious, to have proper justification when we apply military force. And adding to that is the more recent addition of weapons of mass destruction. Unfortunately, more and more countries are acquiring weapons of mass destruction. We just saw, I think this week, North Korea launched an aggressive set of missiles, including intercontinental ballistic missiles that could threaten our allies in our own country. So we need to be more retrospective about how we apply military force, because any conflict has the potential to expand into a greater conflict, enveloping more and more countries and ultimately resulting in nuclear exchanges. So it's incumbent upon us in the House of Representatives, is our constitutional responsibility to make sure that we don't just jump into war at the whim of a president or an executive. Now, just war theory, as we all know, has been developed over the millennia, starting maybe as early as some of Aristotle's writings, certainly with Cicero, with folks like St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, and even more recently, a famous book by Mr. Walzer, Michael Walzer, on just war. So this is not a new theory. It's something that's been around for a long time. But again, no nation has incorporated in modern history just war thinking into the way it conducts its business. So I think this is an important first. Now, the idea of this resolution is to incorporate a structured approach to debating whether the United States should enter into a military conflict. Right now, what happens is the president sends down a request, the House originates a bill, and the bill gets passed into law, and we go into war or authorize military force. So I think having a structured debate would help prevent us from misuse of military force. And that's the idea that I was trying to accomplish here. House Resolution 1009 does not in any way limit executive authority. And as I said, it's really more of a suggestion than it is a force of law at this point in this formulation. So I think it's a good starting point for us to incorporate this thinking into the way we conduct our business. And I just want to make one other point. Since I've published House Resolution 1009, I've had some significant input from just war scholars and folks, and because of that, we've made some changes that I think would be an improvement, and those are really basically clarifying the language of the resolution, making sure that one of the objections was that the original formulation said that all other options have been exhausted, and I think that was a phrase that I think didn't go over too well with some of the scholars. They wanted something a little bit weaker than that. So we have incorporated that thinking, and we will be introducing a little modified version of House Resolution 1009 later in this month or next month. And I guess today, with weapons of mass destruction, with cyber war, and with proxy wars, I think the just war theory should be updated and modified so that we can take into account how to use those military tools justifiably with moral justification in the future. So I'm hoping that this spurs a debate on those issues. And finally, the last point is that at the end of our last session at the Catholic University, there was a little disagreement among some of the panelists on whether, if all the just war principles are satisfied, there's 6 just war principles, if all those principles are satisfied, does that compel us to engage in military conflict, or does it enable us to do if we choose so? And I think that's an important point. I'd like to follow up with that discussion today. I think we can make some progress on that discussion. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Eric. Thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. And what a great setup for this conversation that we're going to be having today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the panelists from your left to right, and then that leaves us with Marianne to start the discussions, but that way we'll have it for the record. Last to speak today will be Mark Levicki, who is a longtime just war theorist. He's taught at the Naval Academy, at the Naval War College. He's the founding editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, and author of important books on moral injury and on how to think about just war and nuclear weapons. Next to him, Georgetown professor of practice, Paul D. Miller. He's written an important recent book, Just War and Ordered Liberty. Paul is a faculty member here with experience at the National Security Council and is U.S. Army officer in the past. Right here, Joseph E. Capizzi, is a full professor at the Catholic University of America. He has an important book on how to think about just war in terms of a larger set of principles about the structure of a society and political order. He is the director of the Institute on Human Ecology at the Catholic University. And then, not last, actually first, will be Professor Marianne Cusimano-Love, a New York Times bestselling author. She's taught here at Georgetown. She's a full professor at the Catholic University of America. And one of the great contributions that she's made over the years is not just to talk about just war statecraft, but to emphasize the importance of peace building, both in track 1 and track 2 diplomacy. She's an expert and active with the Catholic Peace Building Network worldwide. And let me turn it over to Dr. Marianne Cusimano-Love.
Thanks, Eric. I think I might stay. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the conversation today. I'm going to start with a shameless plug for the next Berkley Center, some events that we've been collaborating. Catholic U and Georgetown have a long history of collaboration, including a conference coming up on November 14th and 15th in honor of Father Drew Christensen, who Eric just mentioned, our dearly departed colleague. So if you're interested in these topics we'll be discussing today, we're going to have a much fuller discussion of those. The first day is looking at nuclear weapons issues and some of these ethical issues. And then the second day will be a panel on just war, just peace, et cetera, as well as applications to other issues of the day. So if this is a taste that you want to know more about, please do join us November 14th and 15th here at Georgetown. So shameless plug aside, I do want to address some of the things that the Congressman raised about why it would be important to have this resolution at this time, what the resolution does and doesn't do, and kind of why it matters. So the first, he mentioned that this would be to increase the deliberation about the use of force, to create a set of standards, to have some more structured debate about the use of force within the House of Representatives. So why would that be necessary at this time? Well, he mentioned to make sure that there's not using force at the whim of the executive branch. So we've seen a huge expansion of an executive power called the imperial presidency, particularly in the era in the realm of the use of force. And as the Congressman knows, our Constitution gives the Congress the power to declare war, but that's been used very little in our history. Only 5 times there have been declarations of war. So the war powers power that Congress rightly has from the Constitution has really atrophied. And in addition to that, not only has that power kind of atrophied, we've had executives committing the use of force, the debate has also atrophied. We know from lots of different think tanks who rank countries on being a democracy, the first time ever the United States has been downgraded. We're not rated as a full democracy anymore. high levels of polarization in our politics, but of course as well in our Congress, has denigrated the quality of the debate. So what this is an effort to do is to raise that quality of the debate, to raise the standard of the debate, and to basically fulfill our constitutional obligations to have such a debate. So I think those things are really important and an important reason to raise that at this time. So as a kind of a pushback against both the imperial presidency, and then secondly as a pushback against the increased polarization which denigrates debate. But the third point you can raise, and the Congressman said, this is a suggestion. It's a resolution. It applies to the House of Representatives only. It is not a quote, anti-war law. So this would be disappointing to people from wide varieties of the political spectrum. So whether you are in the pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party or the code pink wing of the Democratic Party, this would not stop a particular use of force in and of itself. All of this does is raise the quality of the debate. So there are many that would criticize this for not going farther in limiting the U.S. use of force around the world, or for being a voluntary non-binding measure that could be criticized as well. But from my work in international relations and on norms development and my books on global issues and beyond sovereignty, here's why voluntary non-binding resolutions like this really matter. And structuring the debate really matters. The U.S. Congress has a history of raising the debate around international issues by either requiring the State Department to put out reports, an annual report on human rights, an annual report on international religious freedom, a ranking of countries that are doing poorly around a whole realm of human rights issues, or who are doing better on human trafficking as well. Putting out those reports does not bind any particular outcome from that, but it has raised the debate both within the United States and internationally. It creates space to have a debate. It creates space for civil society to be able to engage and propose a variety of different mechanisms that you don't have if you don't create that space. Also, voluntary measures can over time become binding. What began as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, again, a declaratory statement, not binding, okay, has become institutionalized in international law across a host of issues, from the Geneva Conventions to the Genocide Convention to what we see today in the Sustainable Development Goals that countries and private sector actors are also working towards common goals. So there is an important reason to have voluntary statements and to raise the debate. And what happens in the United States often has a cascading effect elsewhere. We just were honored to host yesterday the Opus Prize at Catholic University. And some wonderful humanitarians were our finalists, and one walked away, had literally $1 million day yesterday. But what Pastor James, who does peace building in Nigeria, warned us about and encouraged us to consider is that what happens in the United States has impacts elsewhere. So to please be careful about the quality of our debate and what we do here, because people around the world, maybe in unintended consequences, will bear the burden or will have their experiences and their horizons widened. So I think it's there can be some very positive impacts from even a voluntary resolution, and we'll unpack more of it with the following panelists. Thanks for letting me speak.
Thank you, Mary. Mark, over to you. I'm sorry, we're going this way.
Yeah, okay, good. Precedent has been established.
Sorry.
So, yeah,
I'm short, but I like to
that's all right, that's all right. Thank you, Eric, for convening this again, for setting this up, and thank you, Congressman, for the contribution, the opportunity to talk about these important things. I'm really going to actually sort of pick up, I think, on the points that my colleague Mary Ann, just made. And I'm going to do it by referring to our historical precedent. And then secondly, I'm going to make a theoretical point. Because I do think the opportunity for us to think through the impact of just war thinking is one that we should all seize upon. I mean, obviously, professionally, we're invested in it, but it's a great opportunity for us to see how it has affected the way governments think about the use of force, and hopefully by introducing the kinds of conversations that Marianne was talking about, it can continue to impact the way people think about these questions. So the first is the historical precedent. It's one of my favorites, and it's nearly 500 years ago. Some of you guys are familiar with this, when the Spanish discover the Americas, right, and encounter indigenous populations. As some of you know, King Charles I calls a council to ask by what right Spain is involved in engaging these indigenous peoples and seizing their property, et cetera, right? And Bartolomé de las Casas and Sepulveda have an argument, right? King Charles I convenes this conversation between philosophers and theologians and other sorts of moralists to ask, can we be doing this? And what those gentlemen are engaged in is precisely this sort of thinking, moral thinking about both the grounds for that kind of, we'll call it cultural engagement, which is perhaps a little bit too benign a description of what is going on, and also the use of force that is associated with the Spanish involvement in the Americas. And, like any good conversation of that sort, both sides walk away from it thinking they prevailed. But historically, what has been the case is the Las Casas case, which is rooted in the work of Francisco de Vitoria, and which itself is rooted in the work of Aquinas, in other words, which is rooted in the broader just war tradition. All of that contribution informs the development of international law in the world, informs conceptions of the jus gentium, the laws of nations or peoples, and nearly 500 years later, I'm talking about it to you, right? It echoes in history as an important moral contribution to the way cultures engage each other, nation states, kingdoms engage each other that you couldn't predict the significance of at the time. So I think, as Marianne's suggesting, to have these conversations is important in very concrete ways, and I'll get to that in a second, but also in ways that we can't quite anticipate right now. So this is a really wonderful endeavor by the Congressman just to get this kind of conversation going already, and hopefully even to get it into the mere suggestive stature that he described earlier. But I do want to suggest the notion that it's merely suggestive is underselling, I think, the opportunity here for it, and maybe even, again, what it could accomplish. One of my pet peeves, or sort of, important points I make about just war, is that in my reading of the tradition, what it helps us do is keep politics and the use of force connected. And in other words, when politics and the use of force are separated from each other, that's when we run into most of our problems. And another way of seeing this is if you just look at the major American conflicts of the recent past, you can see the ways that detaching those conflicts, the use of force, from discrete political goals, named political goals, can tend towards conflicts ballooning, right, escaping our control. And this was an insight very, very early in the just war tradition of thinking, that war has its own logic, right? And we know this, right, from experience. The investment by nations of resources, material resources, and of course the blood of its soldiers, increases their investment in the outcome, right? And that can lead to this kind of ballooning of the investment, in the war itself, but also the kind of transformation of the goals that one seeks. And the just war account has always identified discrete political goals, the kinds of goals that the use of force ought to be pursuing: community, order, justice. and also excluded the kinds of goals it should not pursue: retaliation, vengeance, right? Other things that are animated by human passions, legitimate passions, right? But that we have to recognize need to be reined in by attaching political goals to the moral use of force. What the conversation, as I take it, in fact, is inviting us to do is precisely that. Name the political goals that this use of force is seeking, right? Make us accountable to those political goals. That can seem, relatively innocuous or merely suggestive, but it's powerful, right? And again, it establishes a kind of historical record, by which we can measure ourselves, measure our conduct, measure our, accountability to those goals, and the ways in which we fail when we do, because, failure is a part of human living as well. So there you go. Those are my 2 points. I look forward to our conversation, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Joe, and again, thank you, Eric, thank you, Congressman, and thank you to the Berkley Center, and to all of you for your time. Where to begin? American thinking about war has been shaped by the just war traditions, more than we, I think, give it credit for. And this resolution is important because it stands in that tradition, it clarifies that tradition, and it makes it explicit. And that's why it's a good step forward for the U.S. Congress and I think for the U.S. presidency. I'm contributing to a volume that Eric is putting together on presidents' just war rhetoric. I'm looking at Franklin Roosevelt's just war rhetoric. And when I went into it, I actually didn't expect to find any because I know how presidents talk. I've been surprised to find that during the course of his long presidency, that Roosevelt did in fact gravitate towards a clear and more explicit explication of the justice of the cause for which the United States fought in World War II. In August of 1941, he said as simply as possible, he said, "Against naked force, the only possible defense is naked force." And I think that is the hard truth at the core of all just war thinking. There is sometimes when we do not have a choice, when justice and peace, liberty and flourishing are at stake, under threat of physical violence, and the only responsible action is to respond with force. That, again, is why I think this resolution, clarifying the United States' intent to abide by just war principles, is such a good idea. I think past presidents have done so. I think future presidents should do so. I think Americans instinctively understand the basic ideas of just war theory. We know that we're supposed to be the good guys. We know that we don't use force in wars of conquest like Russia is doing today. We know that when you do fight, you're supposed to kill only the enemy soldiers, not civilians. We kind of know these things instinctively. Making it clear, making it explicit gives good guidance to our civilians, our policymakers, the population, and the military. Let me offer a few thoughts, kind of line by line, about the resolution that the Congressman has introduced, where I think its especially strong points are, and offer perhaps a few friendly amendments, if I may. And again, this is on the latest draft I have seen. I understand there may be some revisions that have gone about. The resolution says that any war we fight must be in defense of ourselves or our allies. I think it's really good and really important that we emphasize the justice of defending our allies. That is, we're defending the justice of cooperative security. That is the anchor of global order today, cooperative security, embodied in the NATO treaty and the idea that an attack upon one is an attack upon all. If one of our treaty allies, if Germany or France or Latvia or Poland comes under attack, it is legally the same as if American territory was attacked, and we respond in kind. Again, that is the anchor of global security because it is that statement which deters Russia from expanding its war outside of Ukraine into the rest of Europe. It's preventing World War III, and we have similar treaty commitments across the East Asia and Pacific region. So defending the justice of cooperative security is really important, and I'm glad it's here in the resolution. Clause 1A of the resolution stipulates that stopping a genocide is also a just cause for war. I think this is a very strong part of the resolution. It follows a long tradition in just war thinking of saying that states may punish, quote, crimes against nature. That's what they used to call it. The thinkers in the 15th and the 16th century, crimes against nature. They had in mind things like piracy, cannibalism, human sacrifice, or unusually cruel tyranny. Today, when we think about those especially heinous acts, genocide is at the top of the list. If I were to offer a friendly amendment, I might broaden this a little bit and say, use the phrase perhaps crimes against humanity in addition to war crimes and genocide. I think that would be appropriate. Clause 2C stipulates that when we go to war, we do it with the intent to reestablish peace. I just can't stress how important this is. I think if there's one thing we got wrong in our recent wars in the Middle East, it was our failure to fight with the intention to reestablish peace. We proved ourselves extraordinarily capable at kinetic action, at killing the enemy, and I, in my view, did not pay sufficient heed to rebuilding peace. And that, I think, explains a lot of why those wars ended the way they did. Those of you who are familiar with the resolution will know one of the innovative clauses, Clause 1B, says that environmental harm might be a just cause for war. This is novel. It's not in the just war literature. I think I can see a way where it could be a logical extension of that crimes against nature. In this case, very literally so, crimes against nature. I would caution about how this could be interpreted. How do we measure the appropriate level of harm against nature that might justify war as a response? That would be one concern I could share about this. I'd love to see the resolution add in discrimination and proportionality in line with jus in bello. The resolution does mention the cost-benefit calculation, reasonable chance of success. Again, those are difficult to apply because we lack the ability to foresee the future. We lack units of measurement. But as general principles, I think they're fine. To conclude, I just want to circle back and say again, the United States does have a tradition of using just war criteria in our wars. And so this resolution stands in that tradition. It extends that tradition. It clarifies that tradition. Just war is like lenses. It's like glasses. And with those glasses, we can see our history in better light and see our future circumstances more accurately. We can see where we have gotten it right and gotten it wrong in the past. We can see clearly that the Union had just cause, the Confederacy did not. We can see that in World War II, when we did have just cause, we nonetheless did not always fight with proper discrimination. Just war helps us with that nuanced moral perspective. And just war can help us see that in our wars in the Middle East, again, I do think we had just cause, but did not always fight with proper attention to building peace in the aftermath. That's the virtue of using just war to think about our wars, and that's why this resolution would be a benefit to American national security. Thank you.
One of the benefits of going last is I almost don't have to say anything at all because it's been said. So I'm going to sort of serve as just a little coda, putting a bit of emphasis on a couple of points that I think are important to emphasize. And if I had a tendency toward telling dad jokes, which I sort of do have a tendency toward telling dad jokes, I'm going to talk about the proper use of the just war tradition. And if you're following me, JUS, as in the use ad bellum or the use in bello. So this is the proper use. And improper use doesn't mean you can no longer have proper use. So thank you, Paul, for laughing. I appreciate that. I'm going to give you money later. I think it's appropriate that this conversation or this resolution isn't intended to necessarily, well, it's not intended to eliminate war, and that it's not necessarily intended to limit war. And the reason I think this is important is this. I think the just war framework is a constraint. And so it's true that when used, it may well limit war. That we may discover we don't have a just cause and therefore no right to use force. But constraints work, I think, in two different ways. There's both the negative constraint, don't do this, but there's also the constraint that might say, actually, no, do this. And the Congressman touched on this a little bit. It might have been a point of contention in the last, the first time we got the band together. And it may continue to be here. And so I want to talk a little bit about this. There's within just war tradition, there's a long-standing debate as to the presumption that the just war tradition is making. Is it a presumption against war, as some will contend, or is it a presumption for something else? For instance, justice. And I think it's a presumption for justice. Partly why I think this is when you're considering whether or not there's a presumption against war. One of the things that determine that, in fact, we should go to war is the presence of a sufficiently gross injustice. Right? So I think the presumption for justice wins the day. That's summarizing a great deal in very brief terms. We could talk about that. But this idea that it's a presumption for justice has, I think, several implications. The Congressman talked about whether or not if you've got the 6 criteria met, are you compelled to go to war? Or is it really just, you've got permission to go to war if you see fit? I'd nuance that a little bit. There's, depending on who you talk to, there's 6 criteria, there's more, there's fewer. I'll break it down into 6, but 3 of those are what are sometimes called deontological. These are the things that have to be in place before a war could be just, and these are things like sovereign authority, proper authority. You have to have a just cause, you have to have a proper intent. And then the other 3 that I would add would be proportionality of ends, probability of success, and last resort. And those 3 I would phrase as being prudential criteria. So you've got the first 3, which are duties. If you've got these in place, I would argue you're compelled to use force. And then you've got those other 3, the wisdom categories, that might mitigate against that and suggest, okay, look, you've got a duty, but wisdom argues against it, which is to say that you can't always do the thing you ought to do. That's just how the world sometimes structures itself. So goods come into conflict, and more can be said about that. Other implications. There's this idea somebody touched on that, there's enormous resource expenditures that go into war. And war, at least as a means toward peace, is very often about killing people and breaking things. So there's tremendous expenditures of resources. President Eisenhower famously lamented the use of resources that war demands. He put it this way, he says, every gun that is made, every warship that has been launched, every rocket that has been fired, symbolically represents a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, from those who are cold and are not clothed, right? And then he goes through and he talks about the calculus. 1 modern bomber equals 30 schools in different cities, right, or 2 hospitals, and he talks about the costs of war. But elsewhere in his farewell speech, he recognizes that these costs, however grotesque, are necessary, right? And so he says a vital element in peacekeeping is the military establishment. Our arms must be mighty. They must be ready for instant activation, right? And here I think of an opportunity I had to go to the 50th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camps in Poland. And at the end of the formal ceremonies, they began to read the names of all of the dead that were killed just in that one camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau. And they began to read the names, and I toured the camp for several hours afterwards, and the whole while, the names were still being read over the loudspeaker. And afterward, I wondered, how long did it take to read all those names? Because when I left, they were still reading them. And this is a hypothetical because we don't have the names of all estimated 1.2 million who were killed there. But if we had the names of 1.2 million souls that were consumed in that one place, I calculated it if it took 1 second to read every name. So Paul Miller, Joe Capizzi, Eric Patterson, Mark Levesque, if it took 1 second to read every name, it would have taken 13.8 days to read all those names. So those same rockets and warships and bombers that cost us schools and hospitals and other good things are also the things that stood between victims in 14 days or 15 days, right? So those things are necessary, however grim they are. So I would never want the just war tradition to limit our ability or our confidence in standing against 13.8 days or more. With great power comes great responsibility, right? This is the Spider-Man ethic. I don't know if it was first invoked by Jean Bethke Elshtain, who's already been mentioned, but she used to talk about this all the time, and she'd do it in her voice. You know, oh, with great power comes great responsibility, right? Which is to say, America, blessed as we are with enormous resources, ought to build the capacity to do enormously good things, all right? And this sometimes puts us in awkward positions, I think. So I think one of the implications of just war tradition, and I'll end with this, is that I think it rightly understood, it requires a more capacious understanding of what a national interest is than we typically think a national interest is. So the provocation is a national interest is something more than simply power, security, and wealth. All right? It's true. It's in our national interest to prevent, to deter, to reduce military threats, whether they're conventional, nuclear, biochemical, or cyber, both to us, to our forces abroad, to our allies, as already mentioned, to our defense pact partners. National interest is all about protecting global trade, our own financial, energy, environmental systems. So national interest is all that, but I think it's something more than that. For the last 2 days, I've been holed up in a hotel with friends and colleagues talking about character and moral formation in the education systems within the profession of arms. And one of the things that keeps coming out is character and virtue, and that it's incumbent upon human beings, if we want to flourish, to develop character, to develop virtue. Vocationally, it's incumbent upon our warfighters to develop character and virtue, because if the just war tradition promises anything, I think one of the things it promises is that only just warriors are likely to fight just wars with any sort of regularity or confidence. So I think nations, like people, can develop reputations for virtue, a reputation for other-centered acts of self-donation, for caring about others as we care about ourselves, and not everything has to be a zero-sum game. America can develop our own military, financial, cultural, diplomatic, scientific, industrial, and technological powers, and we can use them and deploy them when duty and prudence align, not just to our own good, but to a global common good. And I think it's right, on occasion, to even consider the expenditure of our own lives and treasure in order to do that sort of thing. It makes our power, if nothing else, sufferable to those, or more sufferable to those who are beneath it. And I think that rebounds to our national interest as well. So I'll end there just with that. All right.
Well, with that, I'm gonna turn over to the Congressman for any responses, and then we'll go straight to the audience with about 15 minutes for Q&A.
Thank you. Is there, can you all hear me okay in the back? Okay, well, I want to thank my panelists, my fellow panelists this afternoon. It was a good discussion. I want to thank Professor Marianne for indicating how even a voluntary measure like this can produce significant good. So thank you for those comments. I want to jump to Paul's comment about protecting nature. And I think along with my comments on weapons of mass destruction and proxy wars and cyber wars, we need to think about preserving the natural environment to a degree that we can persist as a human race, as a country. If we allow a portion of the world to be degraded sufficiently that people cannot live there, cannot thrive there, then we are setting ourselves up for long-term problems. And so we need to think in terms of what would be justified. I mean, is it okay for the president of Brazil to burn down the Amazon rainforest? Is that something that can be allowed? Should military force be used to defend that sort of a natural resources and that sort of natural resource? And I certainly don't have the answer to that, but I think Mark was right on in saying that, well, we do have a responsibility. With great power comes great responsibility. when are we going to be compelled to take military action? And one of the caveats of that, in my opinion, is are the American people willing to support a long-term commitment? And because when you first enter a conflict, it's not clear to me that there's going to be a short-term way out of it, a short-term exit. So the American people, you have to have confidence that the American people are going to be committed long enough to attain the objectives that are implied in the military action. So those are some of my comments. Again, I thank all the panelists for, again, taking up the discussion. And I want to point out, this is my last term in Congress. I'm going to be leaving at the end of this year. One of my colleagues, Barbara Lee from California, has pledged to take up this resolution next term, so we'll have her to look to follow up with this tradition. Thank you.
Well, we're going to turn it to you, the audience, if you have questions at this time. We have a microphone in the back. So here's what we'll do. If you raise your hand, the microphone will come to you. And we ask that you briefly tell us who you are, if you have an affiliation, you're a student here at Georgetown, et cetera. And then second, make a brief question that someone or some two on the panel can answer. So do we have any questions or comments from the audience? And we have one right up here in the front. Imogene, thanks.
Want to be the first, but I'm Marcia Sickle, retired from academia really, but still kind of involved in this topic. I have a book published by GU Press, The Making of a Nuclear Peace, and I think what I'm hearing here is something I maybe want to develop further. As several of you mentioned Michael Walzer. He was one of my 3 theorists I analyzed, including Paul Ramsey and William O'Brien. But Walzer said something, I think, that I think the congressman maybe could take to heart, that you're doing this. He said, we need to pay closer attention to find new discoveries in just war theories, found under the old principles of previously excluded men and women. And I think, there are some women involved in just war, but there's a whole different way of coming at it from a traditional just war tradition, and that's from kind of the the bottom up, if you say, not taking the principles from here, but getting the principles from down here. And some of the things we've talked about here about the interdependence of peoples, in the thinkers here, I think in the end it fails because it still allows alliances to look to their own interest, but the needs of the broader humanity is underneath that. And so I tried to find, and I identified it as the bondedness of peoples, which someone brought up as when you were talking about crimes against humanity. It's much deeper than politics, much deeper. So I think we need to go to that because we're talking about nuclear weapons, even tactical nuclear weapons. They're still different from, my heavens, the traditional just war theory of a century ago. So I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that, just getting underneath the interdependence of peoples to something more fundamental, like something like the bondedness
Professor,
of all people.
Thank you for that. I'm going to turn over to Marianne.
Thank you for that comment, and I agree with that assessment. The just war tradition, my work talks about it being very necessary, but not sufficient. It's necessary for limiting conflict, for having these constraints, but it's not sufficient for building peace. And when we look at how do you build peace, the just war tradition has very little to say about that. My whole work has been developing just peace criteria that does come from that bottom up, looking at what are peace builders around the world doing to build a more sustainable peace. I see these as connected. So in the Catholic tradition, I don't take the zero sum, that it's either or, but that you hold both and. You do, and you need to do both of these simultaneously. And I think that when you do that, you're taking into account the lived experiences as well as the very hard-earned toolbox that peace builders around the world have used to end violent conflict around the world that is not necessarily reflected within the limitations of just war tradition. So just war tradition, good, still necessary, but not the full picture of what's needed to build a more sustainable peace.
Next question. Yeah, Professor Halbach, it's come right there.
Hi, I'm David Hollenbach. I'm here at Georgetown at the David Hollenbach here at Georgetown at the Berkley Center. A question that occurs to me is in light of, well, I'm just thinking about the way in which debate takes place in the U.S. government. It's probably not just within the Congress, but it probably has to do with debate within the administration and even within the military also. But I'm thinking about the way in which we've seen over the last several decades some increasingly restrictive criteria placed upon the use of weapons against avoiding civilian casualties, especially by using drones and a variety of other initiatives. Now, some people think that the restrictions that are placed on the military today are too tight. I'm not in agreement with that, but there has been a growing emphasis on trying to protect innocent civilians, not just by, massive bombing of cities, but about specific attacks that are aimed at terrorists or aimed at known targeted killings, so to speak. And there's been a restriction on new norms that have emerged for the U.S. military. I'm interested to know how that happened. Was it a result of congressional debate? Was it a result of debate within the military? Was it a result of the debate within the White House? And what can we learn from that about how we could apply some of the just war criteria more effectively today? And that's just sort of broadening the question beyond the resolution to think about how we can have an influence, because I think there has been some influence, not enough in certain areas, but in that area there's been an influence on restricting the targeting of that could accidentally kill civilians in recent decades. I don't know who might want to respond to that, but anyone who wants to is fine.
I'll
with
take
me.
a first crack at this. From a political point of view, the ubiquity of television coverage into people's living rooms has brought this to the political debate. I mean, in World War II, the bombing of Dresden probably didn't hit American households for years after that event took place. But now, if there's a drone attack, it unintentionally kills two family members, one of them is the children, we're going to hear about it in Washington, in the Congress. And so there's been a much bigger emphasis on protecting civilians because we don't want to be looked at as a force that's for bad and for killing civilians and for what's it called, collateral damage. And so I think that's kind of where I see it coming from. And I think that's something could be used either to strengthen the approach or could be torn down. I'm not sure which direction we're going to be going at this point. Anyone else?
Take a stab at a couple of things. One of the things I would just emphasize that it's not, and I don't think you were suggesting this, but it's not only because we don't want a reputation for killing people or innocent people, it's because we don't actually want to kill innocent people, right? So that's an important stress. And I think we don't want to kill innocent people for all sorts of reasons, right? And one of them is a force protection issue, right? We're asking our war fighters to do incredibly difficult things. They deal, as we talked about earlier, in eternity. And we've learned because of moral injury, which is doing something or seeming to do something that goes against a deeply held moral norm. We understand that pulling triggers has consequences on the souls of war fighters. Whether or not their killing was right or wrong, killing has a traumatic effect. And I think where we can make that killing cleaner, I talk in my book about the good kill, where we can be more discriminate and be more proportionate, we ought to do that. I think it's a force protection issue, right? So, when we develop weapons like, the bladed thing that can, You know, if we're driving in a car, you can kill me and Paul can be fine. I think there's a certain, and this is going to sound ghastly, but there's a certain beauty to that because it allows us to do the things we need to do, and to increase our ability to do the things we need to do while still being discriminate and proportionate, in fact, more discriminate and more proportionate, which has a reputational benefit, and it protects our warfighters. So I just, however that conversation is happening, I think it's a great thing that it's happening. We need weapons that we can credibly use in order to do the things we have to do.
I think we have time for one more question, right here. We're going to take two, because I think we have a student one. We're going to take them both, and then it'll be final responses. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Chris Soper from Pepperdine University. Thank you for the presentation. I'm unaccustomed to 5 academics of one accord, so I'm kind of getting over that. I think we all in this room sort of, well, on accord in the sense of seeming to be supportive of the resolution. So as a political scientist, that makes me ask, what are the political constraints? Or is it coming from the military side? Is it coming from politics? Is it coming from constituents? Maybe the resolution will pass, but we know that Congress has lost power to the president in this area. So I'm just curious, if we're all of one mind, what are the real limitations on, A, this passing, but also this actually being a constraint on the use of war?
And go ahead, right here.
So mine's not unrelated, but it's going to try to highlight the discord. So this has been alluded to, the disagreement between the deriving an is from an ought and the requirement. So I just wanted to hear that further fleshed out. What would be some of the mechanisms you'd like to see, those that are proponents of having that be a requirement, and whether that's, just to hear a little bit more about that disagreement. Oh, and I'm Matthew Vanois. I'm a student here at the MSFS program. Thanks.
Okay. Any takers?
Well, yes, thank you for the questions. The first question, basically, the resolution has a number of co-sponsors, but it's limited, and all the co-sponsors are in my political party. So that's a pretty stark reminder of the political division. And I don't think it's ideological. I think it's purely partisan. Neither party, and this is just being frank, neither party wants to give the other party a win. And so having a resolution like this passed from my office might be looked at as a win for my party. So it's strictly a partisan divide at that issue, which is unfortunate because this shouldn't be a partisan issue. It should be an issue of great national interest. I guess, is anyone else that want to take the second question? Joe?
I wanted to go to the first question, but I don't mind going to the second question either. Governments don't like being told that their decisions are subject to some sort of external moral claim, right? I was a little bothered by the naked force meets naked force quotation earlier, because there's a way perhaps that there's a yes to that, being optimistic, but there's also a way that there's a no to that, if that means something like amoral or immoral, right? You know, force that is not morally, guided towards some good. So a resolution like this suggests, right, there's a kind of presumption that decisions of this sort are subject to moral claims, and merely deciding to do something doesn't make it right, which is typically how governments think, right? Or whether they're a king or a legislature, they think, well, because we're doing it, therefore it's right. So I think that that's partly why it will be resisted. I would disagree with my colleague to my right. This is to the second question, I think, in terms of thinking that a must do this is a consequence of this kind of moral analysis. It suggests a kind of moral determinism that I think this approach would be, my understanding of the just war approach would be resistant to. Unless I misunderstood it, to say that if the first 3 criteria of the just war account are met, you must do something, is not sufficient in terms of analysis, right? And maybe I misunderstood it, but it was right authority, legitimate attention, right intention, and just cause, that's not sufficient for saying that we have to use force to do something. What it's sufficient for doing is, saying that there's something that needs to be addressed, right? It's other things have to be a part of this, and the prudential it's all prudential analysis ultimately, in my judgment too. That prudential analysis will help us understand whether we ought to do something, but must seems way too strong. It's proving too much, in my judgment. Does that get to the question?
Well, we can continue this conversation. It's a beautiful Friday, and we can continue it in this room or right outside at one of the beautiful Georgetown restaurants. But there is another 1:30 event that at least one or two of our folks are actually participating in today. And I know that many of you want to have some side conversations about this. So let me close with just a couple of quick things. First, the just war tradition is clearly in the American tradition. It is things, we see it in the speeches of the Continental Congress. We see it in presidential rhetoric. We see it in Congress. And in the Lieber Code, which during the Civil War becomes the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and then spreads quickly, actually, to a dozen other countries by 1875. And during the 20th century, these principles have been recovered, as Marianne, I think, mentioned early on, in the Geneva Convention, the Hague Convention, and elsewhere. And so they continue to resonate, really because they are true, and they help us to live in a world that is fallen and limited. Now, there are copies of the original resolution available at the back of the room. I hope that you'll take one. I hope that as we break, that you'll take a moment to meet the panelists and particularly meet Congressman McNerney. And let me say one thing from kind of behind the curtain, and that is when he contacted us during the summer, he said, I want you to criticize the original resolution and help us to find people who will engage us in the conversation from across the aisle. And I get frustrated that people say that the partisanship that they see, the screaming that they see on TV is all there is in Washington. Lots of us live in Washington, and we know that there's lots of opportunities to disagree civilly. Most of that happened in emails in August and September before we coalesced for these panels. So we need these moments. They're important moments. And thank you all for coming today. You've actually shared in an opportunity for there to be civil disagreement in Washington. It can still happen. Thank you very much.